Thank you. So, as you said, I'm John Coggeshall, and a little bit about myself before we really get into what is open source. I've been involved with the open source community at large for quite some time. I got involved with the PHP project circa 1996. I was hacking on Slackware and Linux before that, and I've obviously been involved with it ever since. And this talk came to me after I had actually taken kind of a hiatus from open source a little bit a couple years back. Was gone for about 5 years, just didn't come to conferences, I didn't speak. I wasn't really active in the community. I was sort of just more focused on my family and things at home. And I came back and I started speaking again, and the dynamic of the open source community had changed drastically in my eyes. And nobody else seemed to notice. Everyone else, this was just kind of normal. And I felt like I had stepped into like a weird machine that was some sort of parallel universe. And it kind of prompted the conversation in my head, and ultimately led to this talk. So we're gonna kind of take a trip down memory lane. We're gonna start from the kind of beginnings of open source to today, and talk and hopefully open your eyes and get you guys thinking a little bit about how things have changed, and not always for the better. So what is open source? Well, there's about 1,000,001 definitions, right? There's the notion of licensing, and there's notion of all these sorts of things. I borrowed this from Brian over at the Apache Software Foundation. He was the founder of the Apache Software Foundation. And I was there in Austin a couple weeks ago, and he had this on one of his slides, and I thought it was a pretty good definition. Freely available source code, that's obviously something that's pretty standard with open source, but it's a lot more than that, right? It's community. It's the way that community functions, this notion of kind of a duocracy, right? That what matters is people got stuff done, not really how the means by which they did it, and of course, transparency. There's an interesting article, though. If you go back to 1998 and you look at Forbes when open source was kind of out there and growing, Forbes had this to say: open source software has become an intellectual Olympics, where some of the world's top engineering minds compete, not for venture capital, but for impressing their peers. And that is very much how open source was back in the 90s. It was very much an intellectual Olympics, and I like to think of it like this. It was really just a bunch of really, really smart people basically playing a giant global game of intellectual horse. The primary motivation was a bit of competition among peers, but it was for yourself. You did it to show you could do it, to show off a little bit, to have a passion about a piece of technology. And that was a really, really important concept, this whole concept of the qualities of this Olympic field, right? And so when we talk about the Olympic field, we have to talk about, well, what is that Olympic field, right? If we're all competing this sort of intellectual Olympics, right? So Olympic field, well, it was about free knowledge, right? That was an important quality of that Olympic field. It had to be an interesting and valuable thing to you. You had to find it that's something that you could have a passion about. People who contributed to open source back then believed that their work and their ideas mattered. They were idealistic. They said, what we're doing is important, and my ideas as an individual matter in this project. They also had to believe that their validation, their beliefs would be validated, right? That others involved in the project would say, hey, look, that guy wrote really great code, or hey, look at this cool feature that Joe wrote. Those sort of kudos, personal gains, and validations were important. And also that they were doing something in some way that was considered good, not evil, right? And if you remember back in the early 90s, early 2000s, when Google was kind of blossoming into the company it is now, this was kind of how they started, right? Good, not evil. And they really stole that kind of from the open source world at large. And of course, last but not least, it was about ego, right? If we're playing an intellectual game of horse, then ego is what it's all about. It's about one-upsmanship. It's about showing that you can do something and getting the validation that it can be done. And that worked. We built amazing software. Corporations started to notice back in 2000. Dumb ones hated us. So this is a famous quote from Steve Ballmer, CEO of Microsoft, saying Linux is not public domain. Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. Obviously, that didn't play well with our community. What played much better was what the smart corporations did. Companies like IBM. IBM didn't think we were a cancer. IBM poured $1 billion into Linux at the same time Microsoft was calling us a cancer. And at the time, everyone was like, "Wow, that's the ultimate validation, right?" And IBM gets it, and everyone thought IBM was amazing. But the problem is that it wasn't altruistic. And this is what really the point of the talk, that corporate involvement in open source has never been altruistic. It's been strategic. This is another quote from Forbes. This is back in 2008. The old guard have figured out that open source code can be a wonderful way to inflict pain. IBM pumps money into Linux and other open source programs because those programs undermine Microsoft. Microsoft pumps money into Novell, the #2 Linux player, to hurt Red Hat, the #1 Linux player. Oracle offers support for Linux because it hurts everybody. These corporations didn't look at open source the same way we did as the open source contributors. We looked at it and we said, this is an intellectual Olympics. This is us doing things because we can, writing good software and giving it away because it's for the better good. Corporations saw it as a weapon, a way to undermine people. So IBM pumped $1 billion into Linux to hurt Microsoft, and it was as simple as that. And all these corporations, when you see all these banners flying around, here we are at conferences. I've been to more than I can count. And of course, let's thank our sponsors this, let's thank our sponsors that. And corporations like to tout their open source badges, right? But you have to understand that there is no such thing as an open source corporation, right? These guys have a reason, and it's just not maybe the most obvious reason that you can think of. And why was it smart? Well, it was very smart because it really affected change, right? So why was IBM smart to pump $1 billion into Linux? Well, think about what was going on back in the 90s. Maybe you don't realize this, but back in the 90s, the entire financial sector, which now runs Linux, wasn't running Linux. It was running Sun. It was running Solaris. That company has now, of course, gone by the wayside. But back then, it was a powerhouse. It was a major player in the technology fields. And when IBM really started paying attention is when Morgan Stanley CTO started paying attention. And that was really what motivated IBM off the bat. So what Morgan Stanley CTO at the time was seeing was, he was spending, God knows how many millions of dollars on Solaris machines to run his financial systems. And he saw Linux, and he saw the ability to replace those servers with commodity hardware. Basically build supercomputers out of a bunch of desktops and do that using Linux. That was the technology that open source had created that didn't exist for Solaris. And so when Morgan Stanley's CTO started saying this, IBM started looking really carefully at it. And that's when IBM decided to take open source a lot more seriously, again, to undermine Sun, their direct competitor. So we'll pour a bunch of money into Linux, make sure it all runs on IBM hardware, and replace Solaris with this free Linux that was out there and out and about. So it didn't matter though, right? The fact was that IBM put $1 billion into us, and we loved it. Because as much as we were skeptical of corporations, as much as we didn't understand what they were doing and the game they were playing at the time, we were more than happy to take their cash and run. Because after all, every one of us who was the beneficiaries of that cash, people that got jobs working for companies, working open source, or their projects were funded in some way by corporations, at the end of the day, we were still manning the ship, right? So that the PHP project may have a corporate sponsor, so quote unquote, but the people who started that project still were there and still called the shots, still had control of the project, and still could keep things in the same philosophy and keep that same culture alive. So open source people got into the business of selling influence. And if you talk to anybody who was involved in open source back in the early 2000s, this is exactly what we did. This is an awesome quote. I can't believe the guy actually gave this quote to Forbes. But this is the CEO of NetApp describing how Linus wouldn't accept, Linus, the guy who made Linux, if you didn't know the name, I guess. Linus wouldn't accept corporate involvement. NetApp had this problem. All their customers were starting to switch to Linux because IBM was supporting it and everything else. It was a new hot thing. And NetApp, which was a file sharing technology servers, right, didn't work very well in Linux. And so NetApp wanted to contribute to open source and wanted to get their code in and wanted to influence the project so that it ran better on NetApp. Linus didn't want anything to do with it. He's like, nope, I don't trust corporations, I trust people, is what he actually responded with. So NetApp got smart. They basically befriended Linus's right-hand man on the project. They wined him, they dined him, gave him an apartment in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They funded his research at the University of Michigan. They poured thousands and thousands of dollars into him. And as a result, they now had a way to influence Linux. And so NetApp got their code in and got Linux the way they wanted it by buying kind of influence of these key people. And that really worked. So we all started doing that, but there was a cost of all that selling of influence, right? Which is now that as of this year, over half, 63% of contributions to the Linux kernel are done explicitly by corporations. And I think that number is actually very soft. Who's doing the rest of it? Well, it's not individuals anymore, right? The rest of it's done by academics, or it's actually still done by corporations who are literally masking their contributions behind a single contributor. So, for example, a lot of people think Red Hat is the biggest contributor to the Linux kernel, and that would make sense, right? Because Red Hat's the Linux company, but they're not. The biggest contributor is Intel. But you'll never see that on any slides because Intel does a really good job of keeping that secret. But Intel has a division of 650 or 1,000 people who are on the payroll, and their job is to just make Linux run well on Intel hardware. And so, and around the same time, Linus was quoted saying Linux developers picked up sponsors. And that's what we did. It wasn't bad, but it is what it was. The important thing to realize with all these things, with all this history, with all this stuff, is that it is not inherently bad. It's just that there's no such thing as an open source company. It doesn't exist. And any company that says, well, we're an open source company is lying. Companies are companies. Companies are out there to make money. Companies are out there to generate profits. And those are all wonderful things. And they may do so off of open source technology, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the difference is some companies misuse open source, right? Some companies are positive members. They contribute to the project genuinely. They are a participant in the project. And they should be welcomed as such because it's in their mutual interest to support that project. And then there are companies out there that abuse open source, right? That their interest is really just to claim that they're open source, or their interest is to basically use the open source project as a weapon in some way. They're not really interested in the innovation. They're not interested in the community as such, and I'm going to give you a few examples of those. But even then, if the company is involved in open source, I want to make a point of saying this, that individuals within that company are different, right? Just because you work for IBM and IBM is classically really horrible about open source in reality, right? There are some really good people at IBM that are in open source. And if they were ever tried to be pulled out of open source, they would quit. So IBM lets them stay there, and they do a good job of holding IBM's feet to the fire to keep them from getting too far off the rails. And that's actually sort of part of the point of this whole talk, right? Is to point out, and I'll get to that as we go along. So let's talk a little bit about IBM, and we'll talk about a recent thing, Apache OpenOffice. So the story behind Apache OpenOffice is basically something like this. Sun originally did OpenOffice. And again, Why did they do OpenOffice? Well, it was partly a play. A play to stay relevant. I mean, Sun was getting their butts kicked. They lost all their Solaris financial services customers to Linux. So they were trying to kind of compete against Microsoft by offering an open source alternative to Office, right? But finally, when it fell apart, Sun got acquired by Oracle, and for reasons that I'm not aware of, for whatever reason, when Oracle was ready to give up the project and didn't really want it anymore, they weren't interested in maintaining it, they had to ask IBM what to do with the code. There was some contract somewhere along the line where IBM had the ability to basically say, here's what we're going to do with the code if you don't want it. And so Oracle had to go to IBM and say, hey, IBM, what should we do with this code? And IBM said, well, make it an Apache Software Foundation project. Mostly because they have a lot of influence at the Apache Software Foundation, and it was a way for them to manage the code. So there's this big hoopla that Apache made. It was Apache OpenOffice, and IBM was involved, and it was fantastic. And what was the reality was that IBM took 140 developers and put them on the project. They worked on the project. Anybody who tried to contribute to the project, they would reject those commits. They basically wouldn't accept code if it wasn't IBM code, or at least very specifically IBM's plan for the code. So, if somebody wanted to implement a feature that IBM didn't think was valuable, they didn't accept the code. And lo and behold, whatever community there might have been around the project quickly evaporated. And so when IBM saw that the project wasn't working out, there wasn't any support, there was no community, their open source thing, their kind of open source ruse failed, they just pulled all the developers and walked away. And now the OpenOffice project is largely defunct in a lot of ways. There was actually, when I was in Austin a couple weeks ago, there was a lot of talk among people who cared about trying to get OpenOffice to merge with LibreOffice, and which does have a community, but the problem is OpenOffice has the brand recognition. So when a consumer goes to find a Microsoft alternative or an open source alternative to Word, they don't look for LibreOffice, they look for OpenOffice. So OpenOffice has got the brand recognition, but LibreOffice has got the community. And this didn't have to be this way. The reason it's this way is because IBM was playing games with the project. And this happens all over the place for all sorts of things. Adobe did it with Flex, all sorts of these sorts of things. One of the biggest offenders is actually Google Android. So Google, back in 2007, announced Android and something they called the Open Handset Alliance. And it had a very noble sounding goal, open standards for mobile devices. And what the world heard was, we're going to have open source phones. And this is going to be amazing, because we'll be able to hack on our phones the way we hack on a computer and everything else. The reality, though, is that Android isn't an open source project at all. Android is open code, but that's not the same thing as an open project. And the big difference is their governance policies. So if you want to contribute to Android, in order for your code to be accepted into Android, it has to meet what seems like a reasonable thing. It has to meet this compatibility standard. So there's some document out there that's wholly controlled by Google that describes what is compatible with Android. And Google controls this document, and Google can say whatever they want in this document. And so basically, it's a product roadmap. This is what we just describe as compatibility. Unless your code helps further our project toward those ends, even if they're not necessarily the things you care about, even if you could do a better job of implementing something else yourself, we're not going to accept your code. And this was a way that they controlled all the OEMs, all the hardware manufacturers, into making sure that any work that they did on Android fit into Google's master plan. And they ended up sued over it. And I don't know what happened with that lawsuit, but in 2010, an email came out from Dan Morrell over at Google that really called this out, right? It said, it's not like it isn't obvious to the OEMs that we are using compatibility as a club to make them do what we want. And this is what a lot of companies are doing, and then they color it as open source. And It gets a little worse even for Google, because by May of 2013, prior to this, so between 2008 and 2013, at the very least, Android releases were kind of done in sort of a traditional fashion, right? So you would just go and you could download the latest Android release, and you could flash your phone and upgrade your phone, and you could do custom builds and all that sort of stuff if you really wanted to, relatively easily, right? Well, May 2013, Google kind of just inconspicuously during their Google I/O keynote announced that all rollouts of all new future versions of Android would be done through Google Play. And the argument was, well, hey, this is fine because we're trying to address the problem where people are having trouble upgrading and stuff, and if it comes through Google Play, then it'll be a consistent experience and everyone will benefit. So all these new feature rollouts will do through Google Play. But what was not really stated, but the fact, is that Google 100% owns and controls the Google Play platform. So although Android started off in 2008 as an open headset alliance and everything else, now that Google has complete control and it's a real competitive product, with just a few little minor differences, they were able to take over basically the entire project. Now, I mean, basically, what's the point, right? And this is sort of been called out, right? This death of this intellectual Olympics. And it started back then in 2008, and it's kind of only gotten worse over time. The lesson is that that all of these original open source guys, we kind of took our eye off the ball, right? We started selling our influence to our project. We were taking the money and we're collecting checks, and we had our big houses and our mortgages and all these great things, and we did so under the guise that, hey, we are a company, or we as individuals understand open source, and we won't let these companies do too much damage, right? And so that's still true to a certain extent, but the problem is that nobody was checking up on companies like Google or IBM or everything else. When they decide to create an open source project, they call it open source. It kind of looks like open source, it smells like open source, but in reality, it's not. And it's kind of coming to a head, because as of April 6th of this year, so as of a month ago, this was in InfoWorld. Open source gaming or corporate gaming in open source rub raw the free spirits of the open source world, which, because such foundations set up an asymmetric power structure, the would-be contributor amounts to a particularly powerless digital sharecropper. And that is what the press and the public is seeing from the outside now of open source. It's not all true. It's not all true. I don't really necessarily agree with every concept or everything about that statement, but they certainly have a lot of evidence, right? And like I said at the beginning of the talk, I walked away for 5 years, and when I came back, this is the biggest thing that I saw. I saw everyone talking about open source in the context of corporations, not people. In context, communities suddenly were corporate concerns, not individual concerns, and I think it's a really dangerous path we're on. Now, the first answer, every time I brought this up, I talked to all sorts of really influential open source people, and the first time I brought this up, the first thing everyone says is that we're just going to, of course it's open source. No, nothing you're saying is true because I can fork it. Well, as it turns out, that's true, and that's not true. It's not nearly as true as we'd like to believe. This is from an academic paper, Political Economy of Open Source Software. And basically the gist of it is that through governance and through licensing sort of stuff, sure, you can fork open source projects and you can walk away with the code, but the problem is that you can't fork communities. And that's what really matters at this point. These governance policies and these licenses are all designed to create a community that one entity or another can control or cannot control. When you fork code without having the community behind it, it's only marginally valuable. And if, for an example of this, you only have to look at GitHub. The one-click fork of something doesn't really build communities. I fork something on GitHub generally not because I'm working on the project, generally just because I want to copy, I want to hack on it, and it's just easier than creating my own repository. True open source projects the community itself is what matters, and it belongs to the people. Right? It belongs to those who are actually actively contributing. They are measured and treated by their contributions. Where corporate in corporate source projects, the community belongs to the corporation. Right? They're the ones who foster it. They're the ones who define it. They're the ones who set the rules for it. And everyone who gets involved in that project has to play by the corporation's rules, or they don't get to play at all. And the mechanism by which this happens is very robust. Corporations are very creative people. Google, I showed you one example there with Google where the approach was, do you have a question?
I just have a comment.
Sure.
So isn't that kind of what happened with Jenkins though? That they did fork it and the community went with them?
Well, so there's a few different examples of, that's why I made you fork community, not code, right? It's way harder to fork a community than it is to fork the code, especially when the community was fostered to not be forkable, right? And that's the big difference, right? So like a great example of a very useful fork very recently has been Node.js. So Node.js was really, really popular. It was kind of the new kid on the block. It got, lightning struck with it. It hit a real nerve as far as, what it did and how it did it. And it got really widely adopted very quickly. There was a corporation that was kind of involved in that project, right? I can't remember the name of it, but there's kind of a corporation behind it that kind of owned that project. They were mismanaging it, right? They just basically were doing a bad job. And so the key developers of Node.js finally got fed up with it and forked it and created IO.js. And that got a lot of attention. That was something else that was talked about a lot recently at ApacheCon, because all the other corporations that use Node.js now are really concerned. From their perspective, forking it is more than just getting away from somebody you don't like. By forking Node.js, now you've created a fragmented market, right? Now who's going to support Node.js? And there's tens of thousands and millions of dollars in development and products and things that are built on Node.js now, when all the community ran over to IO.js. And so the result was these corporations realized this problem, and again, for purely selfish reasons, have been working very hard with what is now the IO.js community and the old Node.js community to try to recombine that project back into one product, because it's bad news for people for there to be a fork, and so it's a little touchy, but the bottom line here is when you talk about forking stuff, things like Jenkins, you can't fork communities that are on a payroll, right?
What do you mean by that? You can't fork community on a payroll?
So this goes to like IBM, right? So if IBM hires 140 developers and their job is to work on the project, right? And the core of the community is a bunch of people paid by IBM to work on an open source project, right?
They can't leave because they lose their job.
Right, they can't leave to work on the other project. IBM won't let them, right? They'll lose their job or they'll just get reassigned. Developers that are on the payroll are fungible, right? Where an open source developer in reality, they have a passion, right? I have a passion for PHP. I couldn't run off and start working on Python. I mean, I could, right? Technologically, I have the ability to do this, but I wouldn't want to. I like PHP, not Python. Where if I'm on the corporate payroll, I'm doing whatever the guy tells me to do. He wants me to work on Python, I'm going to work on Python. He wants me to work on PHP, I'm going to work on PHP, because my motivation is entirely different. So it's all about control at this point. Now it's all about managing, it's really the same game with a different name. 10 years ago, it was all about control. But that war was waged over licenses. What license is best? The MIT license, the FreeBSD license, the Apache license, the GPL license. And that was what corporations and sort of the open source community worked with. Today, they're okay with the license. We've come to common ground. about a license that works, but now it's the control and the governance of projects that matters. And corporations know this, and they're smart enough to abuse it. And when you look at it, one of the big things I look for in an open source project, right, is does that project govern itself in such a way that it welcomes and encourages individual contributions? Because that is what made open source so amazing the first time around. When it came on the scene, people wrote stuff that they thought was cool, and other people thought was cool. And they didn't do it for money. They didn't do it because the product roadmap told them so. They did it because they wanted to do it and to impress their friends. And that is where you get innovation. And that's the most pure form of innovation you're going to be able to find. If a corporation has basically got an open code base, but they already know kind of the direction they want to go, by nature they're not going to be able to be innovative, right? Because they've got marketing campaigns, they've got stockholders, they've got all these their job, their responsibilities to make money. And sometimes the most prudent way to make money isn't necessarily the best way to innovate. Sometimes it's good enough to leave the product in a kind of a not ideal state because there's no motivation financially to fix it. And so there's about 1 million examples of how this is all true. So what can we do? Despite my railing on corporations, I hope that you guys have realized that I don't think corporations are bad. I don't think corporations are bad, and I don't think corporations' contributions to open source is bad. I think, in fact, it's very good. Open source projects can really benefit from the deep pockets of corporations. But it's important, I think, that we understand what is motivating a corporation, that we understand how the corporation is contributing and making sure that they are aligned with what actually is important for the project, and that we can identify as a group at large, as an industry at large, that we can identify and say that's a corporate source project and that's an open source project, and we know what that difference is. Just like back in the early 90s and in 2000s, we knew what the different versions of free were. I'm actually curious, how many people can tell me what the different versions of free were? Have you guys ever heard this phrase? You should look it up. It was really important in open source back then, right? It was the idea of free speech versus free beer, right? The word free has many connotations, and understanding how that plays out philosophically was really important to the communities. I like to think of it, I like to think of myself when we talk about open source contributors as intellectual Olympians. I think that we're discovering that there's a life cycle to an open source Olympian, an intellectual Olympian. And so we start off with all the various projects, right? And somebody gets involved with one of these projects. At least this is how it was, right? And they do it because they had a passion. They did it because they loved it. They did it because it mattered to them. And they just stood up and they said, hey, here's a piece of code. Here's a new feature. Here's something I did to scratch my own itch. And they were rewarded. These projects grew, and those same people that just simply stood up and got involved suddenly got scooped up by all these companies that loved their work, right? And they become VPs of engineering, and they become CTOs, they become directors of whatever. The same guys they used to go off and have beers with. And that I clearly remember how we all thought it was nuts that all these companies wanted to buy us beer. In the PHP project. We used to go to ridiculous dinners and all this sort of stuff. We thought it was crazy. We would have, you didn't have to get us the craft beer. We would have been happy with Bud Light, But they were wine and dining and this whole thing. And now in the PHP world, a lot of my open source colleagues now work at Facebook. And now they're the director of platform engineering at Facebook or whatever the case may be. And at that point, really, those intellectual Olympians, in a lot of ways, I think it's pretty much like a death. They kind of die, right? Once you become the director of engineering at Facebook of a division or something like that, your concerns change. And it's a natural process. It's not wrong or broken, but now your concerns change. Now it's not about the open source project anymore, right? Now it's about how do you most effectively manage your server farms? How do you most effectively do this? How do you most effectively do that? And it's funny because those same friends of mine that were so passionate about open source, now that they're in these jobs at Facebooks and things like that, you know what they spend most of their time doing? Trying to convince guys like me that I should write hack instead of PHP, which is the Facebook language that Facebook created, that Facebook owns, that Facebook controls, and they try to tell me it's open source, and it's not. It's Facebook's language. And it's important to Facebook because Facebook needs it, right? They need a language that doesn't let people write stupid code as easily. PHP lets you write stupid code pretty easily. You know, it's but they need a language that will scale from a resources perspective, from a human being perspective. So they need a strongly typed language, not a loosely typed language. They need a language that can be compiled down to machine code, so it will run faster, and they have to spend less money on energy and servers, not a dynamically typed language. So Facebook has made a very, very, very organized and very, 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 very aggressive effort to try to effectively co-opt the PHP community for their own benefits, right? So they started off with a project called HHVM, which was a virtual machine replacement for Zend Engine, which is what powers PHP. And they were like, look at how much faster our engine is. Let's make this the default engine. And thankfully, enough people in the PHP project were like, no. But they certainly tried. And when they couldn't make that work, then they came out with Hack. So it looks like PHP, it runs most of PHP code, but it's got all these other great features. Come use Hack. And I think ultimately they're going to fail. I think ultimately they're going to have a language that the only company in the world that uses it really is them. You know, but then again, you know, they paid Wikimedia in order to get HHVM running on their servers so they could start using stuff. There's all sorts of stuff going on. All of these things are really dangerous, right? Because all of these things damage the qualities of that original Olympic field, right? That original arena where people developed and people came up with innovative ideas, right? Most specifically, I think that the idea that their belief in their ideas matters. I'm not going to contribute to open source if I don't believe that there's a reasonable chance that my work is going to be appreciated and used. I'm not going to even bother spending my weekend implementing some cool new feature for Android. I would never do it. Even if I had it in my head, I would never write that code. Because I know, personally I know that I don't want to have to, you know, try to sell myself and sell my idea to Google. You know, I want to sell it, you know, based on its merits, not whether or not it fits into the product plan. And whether people explicitly say that, or whether that's just simply the feeling that people have, the feeling that the barrier to entry to getting involved in a project is so high because a corporation has made it such, I think that's really one of the biggest problems. It's really important, I think. That's why I give this talk. That's why I put it together, because I think knowing the difference between these open source projects is going to be really important now that open source itself has matured, right? Understanding that we don't end up with a wholesale generation of developers who think open source is basically, I go work on this project for Google and maybe I do what they tell me to do, and maybe if they like me, they might give me a job later. Which is really what a lot of new developers coming out of college think. They get involved in open source as a career move, not with any sort of passion in mind. And I think that's being dangerously fostered by corporations, and I think it's up to the community at large to call that out, right? And to distinguish between open source and open code, right? By speaking about the difference, by doing things like this talk. You know, that's my goal, is to educate people and to call out these differences and say, hey, listen, open source is a philosophy more than it is a license. And corporate source is something different. Knowing what that is, being able to distinguish between what that is important. And more importantly, encouraging companies, whether you work for them or whether you just interact with them. Next time you talk to a marketing guy and he says this project is open source, make sure you say it's open source, or is it really just corporate source? Is it really an open project where I can really go do something, or is it only going to be something I can only do stuff that you approve of? Right? Can I really innovate, or am I basically just kind of working for free? Am I going to be that digital sharecropper, just writing code with absolutely no real say in its involvement? So I think there's a real change, and I think that we, as the open source community, especially the ones that were around back in '99 and 2000, who now are the directors of Facebooks and product managers of this and everything else, we have an opportunity to really instill that notion, right? We are in positions of power. There used to be a joke back in the day. Well, the geeks are going to inherit the earth, right? That was our little cry, and obviously to play off of biblical reference. Turns out we won, right? And it turns out we did inherit the earth. And that's fantastic, right? But now it's up to us to really make sure that we do something useful with it. And it's all about really just forgetting not from whence you came. Right? Remembering what this was and how we won. How did we build better software than Microsoft? How did we build better software than these corporations that had billions of dollars in engineering resources? How did 20 guys with a couple beers come up with the Apache software project, the Apache web server? Those things matter, and they're really important to maintain.
So you think it's possible to do that kind of stuff again?
I do. I think it's important to understand what the distinction is, right? I think that if you look at projects, there are examples of projects that do this already. Like Node.js, right, is a relatively brand new technology. And it had a corporation that was kind of behind it, but it didn't start with a corporation, right? It followed kind of classic model now where it's, we wrote this cool software and the first thing we're going to do is build a corporation behind it. But the problem is, but even then, even though the project was mismanaged by the corporation, it was an open project, right? People could contribute to it. People could just sort of enhance it in whatever way they wanted to enhance it. And as long as it was a valuable contribution, it was accepted. And so I think, that's in stark contrast to IBM. I mean, think about it. Every time I think of an IBM open source project or a project that IBM is seriously involved in, and they call it open source, I can't think of any quality of it that's actually open source other than open code, like Eclipse. Right? Eclipse is an open project, open source project. But good luck getting any code into it, right? Good luck having any real influence into it. Because if you make this change, they're going to say, well, you can't do that. Well, why? Well, because it's backward incompatible. Well, what they really mean is one of our biggest customers is paying us $25 million a year, and you're going to break his stuff with this commit. And that $25 million a year is worth, even though it's broken, even though it could be done better, even though all those things are true, your idealistic argument's not going to win because we're not going to get that paycheck otherwise. Those are the sorts of things that you want to watch out for. I think a corporation can even start an open source project successfully, but it's a matter of framing it, and it's a matter of the people doing it realizing that the only way a corporation starts an open source project that's actually an open source project and successful is if there really is alignment between their interests and the project itself. And so that works for something like Node.js, right? Because Node.js was written and then a corporation was founded. Well, the corporation was founded mostly to just promote Node.js and get more Node.js out there and sell services and add-ons to Node.js. So anything that makes Node.js more better is going to make the company better, right? Because it's creating more market penetration. That's not necessarily going to be true in fact, it's not true for most projects. So I do think that we can go back. I do think that if we ask a corporation what their open source policies are, I think that just as we used to care what licenses were, we used to be extremely passionate about what kind of license you ran, or if you were proprietary software. I think that if people realize that the same thing matters now for governance, the same thing matters now for the community behind a project, that we can again kind of course correct corporations into making sure that they don't, have projects. The Apache Software Foundation, they had a keynote when I was there, like I said, a couple weeks ago, and I gave this talk, and I was sitting at the keynote, and it was a corporate sponsored keynote. It was, I don't even remember the guy. It was Geode or something, some geolocation tackers. I don't even remember. But he was up there. He had sponsored the conference. He got his spot at the opening keynote, and that's all fine and dandy. And he was so excited to announce to the entire Apache Software Foundation at this keynote that their project now had a silver membership, and for $1,000 you could get a vote in the project. This was their definition of open source. This is what open source was, and I found it shocking, first off, that the ASF would even let them on stage and say that. And secondly, not only did they let them on stage, but not one person after the keynote said a word about it. Everyone's just like, And it's staggering to me. You're talking about I have to spend $1,000 just to be able to write code for you now on an open source project. That's really the type of thing that I'm looking to combat. So that said, I'm happy to talk about this. I'm happy for you to tell me I'm wrong. I'm happy for you to do all these sorts of things. My goal with this is to generate a conversation. So. If you've got anything you'd like to talk to me about, I'm certainly going to be available, and I'll be wandering around. But thank you very much, and I appreciate it. Have a good rest of the conference.